Welcome, everyone, to Attitude Magazine's weekly ADHD Experts webinar broadcast. Today's webinar is in our Back to School, Successor School series, which we do every year, and we have a wonderful series of terrific speakers. Today, we'll be talking about strategies for better behavior in the classroom, the elementary and middle school classroom primarily, for children with attention deficit disorder and other executive function disorders. I'm super pleased to welcome back Shari Gent, who's an educational specialist and trainer from Fremont, California. Shari was with the California Department of Education until very recently. She's a frequent presenter around the country at conferences for teachers and parents, as well as an advisor to CHADD, the National Organization for Attention Deficit Disorder. So we're very pleased to have her today. She will be talking about why traditional behavior strategies often fail with children with attention deficit disorder. And she'll present some practical strategies for improving classroom behavior, especially for teachers, but also giving parents who are listening in strategies that they can use as well. So, Shari, thanks so much for joining us today. We are always happy to hear your useful tips. I would also like to extend a big thank you to the sponsor of this week's webinar. It's Play Attention. We're so grateful to our sponsors. They allow us to offer these weekly webinars at no charge to anyone, to members of the Attitude community. Play Attention this week. They are a brain training system, really the only one that combines both neurofeedback with cognitive behavior training, and with the goal of improving attention, behavior, and learning skills for both children and adults with ADHD. Play Attention is available for both home and professional use, and something special this time, they are offering a back-to-school discount for listeners of Attitude webinars. It is a 15% discount available through Friday, August 18th. And please say, if you're taking advantage of it, that you were a listener to Attitude webinars, and visit the Play Attention website. It's www.playattention.com. So thank you, Play Attention. Before we start some housekeeping, Shari Gent will present, and then she'll take your questions after the presentation. So please post them in the chat box on your screen at any time. The slide presentation is available now for download. You'll see it in the handout section of your control panel. And later today, you'll find the webinar available for replay on the Attitude Mag website, attitudemag.com/webinar. You'll find a large array of Attitude webinars there also on other topics related to school. So check out that resource. And that's it. With that, let me turn it over to Shari, again with our thanks.
Thank you so much, Susan. I'm delighted to be here today. I want to take a look at our goals for this morning and this afternoon. Our overall goals are, first of all, to understand why traditional behavior intervention works for most students, but it often fails for the student who has ADHD. We'll be exploring many practical strategies for dealing with classroom behaviors that meet 3 basic guidelines that are suggested by research. And finally, we're going to look at some ways that parents can support teachers in helping their child manage behavior at school so he or she can learn better. And in addition, one of my goals is to have enough time to answer your questions about this presentation. Well, how often do we as teachers feel completely helpless in the face of student behaviors? This is usually because we expect to be able to control our students. The good news and the bad news is that actually the only behavior that we can truly control is our own. So no matter how hard we try, we can't make our students behave. Fortunately, though, we can learn some evidence-based strategies that will teach our students new and more appropriate behaviors that will encourage them to take charge of their own behaviors and set themselves up for life success. Keep in mind that, as Ross Greene so aptly stated, they would if they could. When kids engage in misbehavior, they're demonstrating a skills deficit. Young children enter kindergarten. When they get to school, they're eager to learn. Unfortunately, some are more ready than others due to their unique neurological makeup and their personal experiences. Behavior is communication. Kids often don't have the verbal negotiation skills or the impulse control that they need to tell us what they want. So instead, they'll tell us through their actions. So when we see behavior, we need to ask ourselves, what is the reason or purpose? What are they trying to tell us? All behavior has a purpose, or the technical term for this is function. If we examine any behavior that we see over time, we find that it recurs in patterns, and that behavior tends to occur when similar conditions and triggers are present. If we can identify the triggers or antecedents, we can oftentimes prevent undesirable behaviors from occurring and encourage learning behaviors to take place. Well, why do typical behavior interventions fail for kids with ADHD? Well, in the case of kids with ADHD, they're bringing to their first day of school a certain neurology that is a little bit different than other kids. So because they have a brain that is less active than the typical student, the student with ADHD is constantly seeking stimulation. Unfortunately, students with ADHD don't always distinguish easily between positive and negative stimulation, and they oftentimes misinterpret the social intent of the stimulation. I oftentimes tell the story of my own son who has ADHD. When he was in 3rd grade, I received a phone call to come pick him up at school for some disruptive behavior or another. When I got to his classroom, there he was standing outside the door. And when the class saw that I was there to pick him up, they cheered. Well, my son thought this was great. He didn't really get the idea that they were cheering because he was leaving, but it was that stimulation of the cheer that he was attending to. And then as students progress through school, although they come to school with the best of intentions, they often experience failure and rejection. As a result, sometimes they learn new behaviors that may communicate their frustration, but are not always appropriate. This is just an illustration of 2 brain scans that show the inactivity in the brain of the child with ADHD versus the typical brain. The little red dots are areas of activity. See, there's far fewer in the child with ADHD. So kids with ADHD are seeking stimulation. Another factor that we need to consider is the fact that brain development is delayed in the student with ADHD. So their behavior is going to be more characteristic of a younger child. The researchers at the National Institute of Mental Health looked at brain development over time, and they found that although the brain develops in the same way in the child with ADHD, and the child with ADHD has all the talents and abilities of the typical child, it just develops at a slower rate. In fact, what they found is that kids with ADHD can experience up to a 30% delay in life skills, organization, daily living skills, getting along with others, social maturity. This means that a 7-year-old is more like a 5-year-old, and a 16-year-old is more like an 11-year-old in these areas. And so a lot of times when we plan to teach a certain behavioral skill or organizational skill to the typical child in the 6th grade, this needs to be repeated all the way through middle school and sometimes into the high school level for the child with ADHD. And also keep in mind the fact that behavior and achievement interact. Think of all those high-achieving kids that we know that are successful in school. How often do they misbehave? Typically not very often. And so what we find is if we intervene in behavior, we're going to see improvement in academic achievement. And as we see improvement in academic achievement, we're also going to see, coincidentally, improvement in behavior. As Chris Ziegler-Dendy, author of Teenagers with ADHD, states, the best therapy is academic success. One way to promote positive behaviors is to ensure that the student experiences academic success. Teachers can do this by providing work at a level that enables kids to succeed. So particularly when you're giving independent work, be sure that it's at the student's independent level. The independent level is that level where the student can complete the work at 95% or above accuracy. Keep a disability mindset. Remember that in addition to dealing with typical school stressors, the student with ADHD also is learning to cope with a neurology that's significantly different. So although the child's behavior may seem very willful, it is in fact a product of his or her neurology or his or her ADHD. Let's take a look at 3 basic principles that will help us understand the types of interventions that we may want to use with the student who has ADHD, and it looks like one of the letters slipped on this slide. But let's first of all think about providing a lot of external structure. Because the student, him or herself, oftentimes has difficulty structuring their lives and organizing their lives, we need to provide this externally until they can become mature enough to internalize it. That kind of structure can become boring, and that's one thing that kids with ADHD react strongly against: boredom. So we want to provide some novelty in order to increase their attention or interest within that structure. And finally, we want to help the student with ADHD make a strong link between cause and effect by providing consequences that are immediate, intense, and frequent enough to satisfy that need for stimulation. Let's take a look at some interventions that incorporate the whole idea of structure, predictability, and consistency. Kids, when they know that what the expectations are and they can predict what happens, they feel more in control of themselves. At the beginning of the year, it's so important to set behavioral expectations right away. And one way to do that is to involve the students in determining the rules that will promote learning for everyone. Students do instinctively understand that they're in school to learn and that they need to have an atmosphere that makes that possible for everyone. Be sure to state the classroom rules in a positive way whenever possible. Incorporate your school-wide standards. Set priorities, maybe 3 to 5. I guess here we have 6, but that would be the maximum rules. And refer to them during the day. Just posting something on the bulletin board does not guarantee that it's going to sink in. We need to refer to these rules and expectations and refer to our schedules throughout the day. And another thing, consider incorporating visual supports as well as just the written words. Research has shown that kids attend better to written material that has some sort of pictorial content as well as words, written words. Be sure to help kids, again, feel that they're in control by having a predictable daily schedule, and again, refer to this frequently. Be sure to check off or have a student check off and show progress through the day on the schedule. The schedule on the left is one example of a schedule for middle school kids. The schedule on the right is for younger kids, more appropriate for kids that are learning to tell time and need things at a little simpler level. The one on the left does have some information for homework, what the objective of the daily lesson is, and so it helps kids to focus, but it's a little more complex than the one on the right. In addition to teaching behavioral standards and making those clear, we also need to explicitly teach daily routines. Routines such as lining up, walking down the hall, taking your seat when you return from recess. When a student has difficulty learning and adhering to a routine that you've already taught, sometimes they need some reinforcement. This particular strategy is called a cue card, and it's an example of a strategy that I used with a student who was in the 4th grade, who the routine in returning from recess, and returning from recess is one of the hardest times of day for kids with ADHD. That's one of the most difficult transitions, moving from an unstructured to an unstructured setting. This student was required, the whole class was required to do silent reading after recess, which is somewhat challenging. And the student had a difficult time orienting himself. So we designed a cue card that included the specific steps that he needed to follow upon returning from recess, and he used this to check off each one at completion and received a reward at the end of that silent reading period when he was successful. It's a good idea when you're giving directions to the whole class to be really consistent. One way to do this is to choose an auditory, gestural, or a visual cue to let them know that you need their attention. There are many of them out there. I'm sure you've generated their own. I remember that was one of the first things I learned when I was doing my student teaching. We always had the cue lights, camera, action to get the student's attention. But one type of cue that you might want to consider as well is always standing in the same spot when you plan to give directions. This can be a great silent cue. If you're interested in seeing an example of the one-spot method, please visit the teaching channel and do a search for one spot, and you will see an example of how that's implemented in the middle school setting. But I just want to say that sometimes just that silent cue, once the students are used to it, seeing you go to that one place in the classroom, you will be amazed at how over time they will immediately begin to give you attention, and you won't have to constantly nag them in order to get it. All right, how can we verbalize directions to be sure that they're listening? Well, the first thing you want to do is get their eye contact. I mentioned providing step-by-step directions, such as those that we saw. You might want to write the directions on the board in the same way that we saw on the cue card. Be consistent about the words that you use. Today is, yesterday was. With younger kids, you can kind of sing-song your directions, so you be sure that you have their attention, but the main idea is to chunk the information. And then check for comprehension by asking a student to repeat what they heard. Difficulty with emotional control is a big part of ADHD. Kids with ADHD feel emotions more intensely. They have more trouble than others in putting on the brakes. Unfortunately, emotions are abstract and they're often difficult to identify. One way to help students gain control is to help them learn to notice the signs of an emotion in their body and identify the steps that they can take to remain calm when they feel those signs. The emotional thermometer is a good visual reminder to help them do this. You initiate this in a one-to-one setting with the student to help them identify the triggers, how they feel, and what they can do in order to remain calm. If you're interested in implementing something similar with the whole class, there are a number of commercial programs available out there. One of them is the zones of regulation, which you start in a small group, and then it is most effective when generalized eventually to the whole class. So you can get more information on the zones of regulation at www.zonesofregulation.com. You see here an example of one visual support that helps kids identify their feelings at any given time. Another example is the incredible 5-point scale, originally designed for kids with autism, but I've been really successful in using it with kids who have ADHD as well. And sometimes I need to adapt for younger kids, maybe 3-point scale. So you have to be flexible depending on your student's needs. Be sure when you're starting the year to provide a time and a place for everything that you're planning to do, and make that clear. Post the areas so that the students know what part of the room they need to go to for a specific activity. Studies have shown that students with ADHD do best when they are seated within eye-shot and earshot of the point of instruction. So in this case, we found that the U shape is the most effective way to seat kids with when you have a classroom that includes students with ADHD. They can be one large U shape or multiple U shapes. And when you're seating kids at a group table for instruction, we're oftentimes tempted to seat the student next to us because we feel we can grab them easier. But instead, we want to be sure that we seat the student across the table from us in some way so that we can make eye contact with them and they can hear everything that we're saying. Moving on to taking a look at how we can offer immediate, intense, and frequent consequences. It's generally a good idea for students who work with challenging students to target their behavioral and academic intervention strategies to coincide as closely as possible with the time and the place where the student actually engages the behavior that you're trying to influence. We're more likely to be successful in getting a student, for example, to take his crayons to afternoon art class if we remind the student just as the class is lining up for art than if we remind him or her at the beginning of the day. So rewarding a student for staying in his seat that day would really be more effective if given at the end of that particular work period, or perhaps at the end of that day, than if you expect the parents to provide that reward at home. So just remember that teacher interventions tend to become more effective as they're linked more closely to the time when the student performs the behavior. We always want to have our feedback be as positive as possible. It's okay to give criticism occasionally, but we find that a ratio of 5 positive comments to every criticism or correction is most effective for helping kids with ADHD begin to tune in to positive stimulation and to provide them with a positive experience. We want to describe exactly what the student did. For example, Sammy, I really like the way that you began to put your name on your paper. It's very legible, and I can see that you're getting started. We want to be process-oriented. We want to focus on the effort that the student put in, not on how smart they are. And sometimes older kids may prefer some private form of recognition, so whispering to them, giving them a note, talking to them outside of class about how well they're doing is all most effective for older kids many times. All right, we want to have some type of systematic behavior management system for the whole class. That could be a token, a point system. Could be, you could set up small groups within your classroom to receive small group points that goes toward the whole class system. But overall, we want to have some type of structured behavior recognition opportunities for your class. Be sure to make those points meaningful. And sometimes we can tie them in with the curriculum. For example, here is a behavior system that makes use of a large number line at the front of the room. When students engage in acceptable behaviors, the whole class gets points moving in the positive direction. If there are some behaviors that are not conducive to learning, then the little dot may move in the negative direction. This reinforces addition and subtraction and positive and negative numbers, at the same time making clear how well the class is doing behaviorally. If you would like to watch an example of how this system works, please visit the teaching channel at this link. Sometimes it's difficult to provide individualized recognition for 30 students at a time. Using computer support for this can be very effective. Class Dojo is one electronic system that we might want to use. Points can be rewarded on your using your cell phone or using an iPad, using projecting on the board as well. You can have a student assist in rewarding points if you have trust in that student, or you can direct that student to do this. That there's a great tutorial available for you to watch at this link online that shows you how to implement Class Dojo. An alternative to Class Dojo that uses real photographs, that's oftentimes more effective for older kids who don't like the cartoonish aspects of Class Dojo, is Red Critter Teacher. And here's the link to Red Critter Teacher for you to explore some options. It's very similar, but it also ties in with other aspects of the curriculum besides behavior, and provides ways to recognize students for other activities as well. Parents can help by returning the behavior report card. And this is a great way to keep parents involved if you're a teacher. And this is just an example report card that was created for CHAD. There is an online report card generator that you can generate your own specific report cards that address your individual student needs at interventioncentral.org. And anyway, so these are the behaviors that the student is working on, and then over here, the periods of time or the activities when the student will be working on those behaviors. Let's take a look at some ways that we can introduce interest and novelty into these highly structured systems that we've been talking about. First of all, a big principle of behavior management, especially for kids with ADHD, and one way to avoid defiant behaviors, oppositional behaviors, is to provide kids with choices. This also gives them a way of managing, feeling that they're in control. So when you're looking at reinforcers, be sure to give your kids a choice on what type of reinforcer they want to work for. This is an example of a reinforcer survey for older students who may be literate and able to write their responses or dictate their responses. And this is an example of a picture reinforcer for younger kids. Another thing you may want to do with very young kids is observe them in the classroom and take data on which areas of the room they choose to be during the free time activity. The good behavior game is one way to increase motivation by changing up behavior support into a game, a fun activity. In the good behavior game, students are divided into teams to compete in demonstrating an identified behavior or maybe two behaviors. This intervention is best done during a short problematic time of the day rather than all day. There is PAX, P-A-X, has a actual good behavior game that you can purchase, or you can create your own following these guidelines. So the steps are choosing a time when you need the specific behaviors to occur, determining what the goal behaviors are, and a good way to do this is with your students. Again, choose the rewards for the classroom and how often they're going to occur. Practice the good behavior game at least once, and then divide the class into teams and play the game. Using a timer is a good idea, and be sure to praise appropriate behaviors that you see. A number of scientific studies suggest that physical exercise, as opposed to mental exercise, can actually improve our cognitive abilities. One study by Charles Hillman, who is a professor of kinesiology and community health at the University of Illinois, found that children who regularly exercise displayed substantial improvements in executive function. These kids were better at attentional inhibition, which is the ability to block out irrelevant information and concentrate on the task at hand. And they had better abilities to move between cognitive tasks. Children who had attended the most exercise sessions showed the greatest improvement in their cognitive scores. So how does that research translate into interventions in the classroom? To help students with ADHD focus better and manage their energy, be sure to incorporate movement breaks and also movement activities into classroom instruction. So here are 5 examples that can help support attention and focus. Yoga has been demonstrated to be an excellent way to help kids integrate and to learn to gain some control over their feelings, as well as to relax. Another fun activity to incorporate is having kids march in place as they recite and memorize. So memorization can be kind of a boring activity, but having them move as they memorize helps to reinforce those facts in a bodily way. Using response boards, which are whiteboards, so having the whole class write their response, for example, displaying a math problem at the front of the room, having all the kids write their response and then show it on command, that increases the rate of response for kids in the classroom and involves those kids who are reluctant to raise their hands. Word hop is a fun activity where you can put sight words on the floor and have kids jump from sight word to sight word. And then there is a program available called Math and Movement. And I've placed the link up here. There's a picture over here of an example of one of the activities in Math and Movement. Math and Movement has tons of movement activities for all grade levels. You can check that out on your own. Fidgets can be helpful, but not for all kids. Not all fidgets are appropriate for every child in every setting. The way a fidget works is it satisfies the need for stimulation so that a child can focus. But again, you have to use your own judgment because sometimes fidgets can actually be distracting. Here are an example of a couple of different types of fidgets. These are balloons that are filled with cornstarch that are squishy and fun to touch. The particular balloons here show different feelings. These are hokey chairs that move and provide some stimulation during activities when the child is required to remain seated. And this is a stretchy band, which you can make yourself, actually, or you can purchase, that you can make out of a nylon stocking or a piece of rubber from a tire. And the kid who needs to kick or move their legs during classroom activities can have the opportunity to do so without making a lot of noise and being disruptive. As a parent, what can you do? Well, it's really important for us parents to realize that we need to be proactive. Raising a child with ADHD, unfortunately, requires a lot more work and dedication than raising your typical child in many ways. You're going to have to be proactive in communicating with your child's teacher, or in the middle school or high school level with your child's designated contact. Be sure to sign and return communications like homeschool reports as soon as possible. And again, you sometimes will need to educate your child's teacher about what it means to have ADHD. Don't just assume that every teacher has specialized background in the area of ADHD, because teacher preparation programs vary from school to school. And also, you know your child best. Be sure to take a disability perspective, as we spoke at the beginning. We spoke about at the beginning. It's your child is the way they are because of their ADHD, not because they're, quote, bad. Another thing that you can do is organize your home for success. Be sure that you have things within easy reach of your student in the morning before they go. You can do a backpack check when they come home and before they go. Attitude magazine has a lot of webinars on organizing your home for success, so check those out. For teachers, sometimes a student's behavior is beyond your ability to intervene. When a student engages in behavior that may be a danger to himself or others, you need to seek additional help. Consult your student study team, talk with someone who's a behavior specialist or a psychologist. Whenever the behavior interferes with learning to the point where a change in placement is being considered. And I want to leave you with one additional resource. PBISworld.com is an online resource that was designed by a behavior specialist and provides specific interventions for specific behaviors at all levels. I just thought it might be helpful for your further exploration when you're looking at positive behaviors. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to answering your questions, and I believe we've left enough time.
That's great. Thank you so much, Shari. That was really, really interesting. I'm just going to post to the listeners a download that has been very popular on the Attitude site, which is that you can print out, and it explains. It's from Chris Dendy, who you mentioned, who's a ADHD teacher expert. And it's a download that you can hand out to a teacher that explains ADHD well. So let me just post that link now, because I think you'll find it useful, those of you who are asking about how to explain ADHD in the class to the classroom teacher. We have lots of good questions here. People are really like some of the resources you gave, and some of the examples are really terrific. Here's a question, which I think is a pretty common question that we hear. What's the best way for parents to approach their child's teacher with some of these ideas? What do you suggest?
Yeah, I like your suggestion, first of all, by meeting with the teacher at the beginning of the year, introducing the fact that your child has ADHD, and kind of letting them know what they might expect, and beginning to establish that disability perspective from the beginning. When, in terms of actually suggesting interventions, I think it's you just have to do that with respectfully and understanding that the teacher oftentimes feels they're an expert. So make it, just suggest it. Say, start by saying something like, well, I have heard in my reading and my exploration that this is something that might work. And I'm thinking that it might work for my child in particular, and just explain the reasons why. I think most teachers are willing to listen and willing to hear your suggestions, as long as you present it in a respectful way.
Right.
And always maintain that polite relationship with the teacher, because that's the essential connection that you need to have.
Absolutely. Yeah. Interestingly, we have 3 or 4 people who have brought up something that's very troublesome to them, which is that their child has been denied recess because of behavior problems. What's the best way for a parent to respond to that, to address that? And what's your thinking on recess?
Yes, recess, right. I am really glad you brought that up, because I actually considered including a slide about that. The thing is, remember, we spoke about how important movement is for cognitive development. I think you could bring that information to their attention, and ask them to find some other way to provide a strong consequence for your child, other than taking away their opportunity to move and actually engage in an activity that research has shown improves their school performance. So maybe be open to having some consequence for your student, because I think sometimes teachers, when you confront them about what they're doing and suggest that it's not appropriate, sometimes teachers interpret that as like, you think your child doesn't deserve a consequence. So being open to accepting some consequences for your child, because it's actually going to be helpful for them, but maybe recess isn't the right one.
So someone has posted, who's listening in, that it's against federal law to deny recess. I keep calling it recess. She says you can take this to any school board if you do not get support. Is that true in your experience?
Well, I actually haven't heard of that. I know of a lot of schools that continue to bench kids on, like they go out to recess, but they have to sit on the side. I'd love to hear what that federal law is. I haven't actually heard of that, but it's possible. I don't know everything.
Yeah. Seems pretty great if it's true. But I mean, everybody should know about it if that's true. Yeah. Interesting question from someone who's asking whether these behavioral strategies that you described for the classroom, do you think they could work at home?
I think the basic principles can work. I think also, for example, explicitly teaching your routines in the morning, having some visual support to show those routines, or teaching homework routines, having routines posted, a regular routine for homework. All of those things are effective at home as well as at school. And also, keeping things positive is so important. Maybe doing some fun activities at home that involve movement. Or like one of the things I used to do with my son for cleaning up his room is to choose a favorite song of his and play it. And he had until the end of the song to accomplish whatever number of tasks we had for cleaning his room. we had set up in advance. Yeah, so sure. It's
Okay.
just that you don't want to do it exactly like you would at school.
Right.
Chad has some trainings, parent to parent online, that teach behavioral strategies directly for the home, and they're based on the same principle as the ones for school, but they're more home friendly. That might be a resource for you.
Yeah, I think Chad has some great parent training programs, as I recall it.
Right, they do. It's called Parent to Parent, and it's online at their website.
What people are wondering about is what do you think good consequences are in the classroom? And there's a question of whether you can offer some suggested consequences. I think that's always an issue for people coming up with consequences.
Right. Well, as I mentioned, consequences should be positive in the main. Mm-hmm. So like things like taking away recess, or things like, any punishing events should be kept to a minimum. I mentioned that I would suggest that each teacher survey their room and find out some positive things that kids enjoy doing. You can do simple things like have a classroom store where you have items that students can exchange their points for. There are Positive Environment Network for Trainers has online, they have a list of positive consequences for kids in elementary school. If you contact me, I can probably send you that list if you're interested. It has a lot of ideas, but I wanted to mention that it's best if you choose those reinforcers that the student wants rather than imposing reinforcers on them. So as I mentioned in the training today, if you survey your students and find out what they like to work for, they're going to be your best source to find out what you can have available for them for positive consequences.
Okay, sounds great. Kate posted that it's by law in at least 10 states that you cannot take away recess, and a couple of people have chimed in that in their state that's the case. So investigate, folks. Right. Yeah. Let's see. We have a lot of interesting questions. Devin says, I wrote a letter for my son's upcoming 4th grade teacher that explains his strengths and weaknesses. Do you think it's okay to give it to her on the first day of school? And if so, would we write it as an I letter from my student or from the parents? We have some formats on that also, Devin, on our site. I will look for those links and post those, some formats for explaining your child to the teacher, but I'd be interested to hear what you have to say, Shari.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I think sometimes, though, teachers like to discover the strengths and weaknesses themselves. You kind of have to use your own judgment on this. I would contact the teacher personally rather than just giving them a list, and meet with them. Then you can begin to use your own judgment about whether you think, when and where you think this teacher will be receptive. I would definitely talk with them first before I just send a list in.
Okay. This is a teacher who just posted. She said, I would prefer parents contact me prior to the first day of school. So that's interesting. I guess if that's possible, that would be a good way. And from what you're saying, you want to have a relationship with this teacher, right? I mean,
right. Exactly.
Here's something. Mother of a 10th grader who's very uncomfortable when her parents communicate with her teachers. She doesn't want anyone, she doesn't want to have ADHD. She doesn't want her teachers to know about it. She's embarrassed. She's humiliated.
Yeah, that's a common problem with high school students. I think, number one, you have to be respectful of your student. But one way to help counteract that is one thing that I used to do with my son is actually set up meetings with that student's teachers, with you and the student present. And so you begin to teach the student how to communicate their personal needs, because ultimately when your child goes on to college or community college, there's not going to be the parent there coming in and talking with the teacher. So you want to transfer that skill to your students so that they begin to become advocates for themselves. And sometimes you can, I used to have my son read the article and share an article with the teachers. And I was really shocked at how many high school teachers do not know or understand the implications of executive function and don't actually realize that it's a neurological condition that the student has.
Right.
So I think really beginning to have you transfer that responsibility for advocating for themselves to your child is a good idea. Sometimes another thing I notice is that kids with ADHD at the high school level tend to make friends with other kids who have ADHD. So having some sort of a peer community can help provide support for that student.
I think that's a good tip to start to encourage kids to advocate for themselves somewhere in high school, because as we know, by the time they get to college, they'll be on their own. So, let's see. Oh, this is a sad one. Diane, as a teacher, says, as a third grade teacher, I found that my students with ADHD all come to third grade already feeling bad about themselves because their behavior has disappointed the adults in their lives. How can a teacher help with this feeling in a student?
Right. Well, some of the strategies that I mentioned today, I know it is really sad that already by third grade they've experienced failure. But some of the strategies I talked about today should be helpful. You really want to overwhelm these kids with positives. Another strategy that comes to mind to me is giving them personal attention. For example, maybe in the form of something called a personal moment, where every student gets to spend like 5 minutes or 3 minutes with the teacher on an individual basis at some time during the week, or depending on how many students you have, where you just get to talk to the student and establish a relationship with that student. And that way, when you're being positive towards that student, it comes from a place of the heart, and the student makes more of a connection. So that's another option, as well as overwhelming the students, 5 positives to every correction, keeping things as positive as possible, and just inundating them with positive experiences and being sure that the independent work that you give them is at their level of success.
So I think the personal relationship and personal attention is tremendously powerful with our children with ADHD, without question. So let's see. Such interesting questions here. Joanne, do children's brains with ADHD eventually catch up, or does it continue to be 30% behind throughout their lifetime? That's a question we frequently hear. I'd be interested in what you think, Shari.
That's an excellent question. They say that about 30% of kids will, in fact, normalize by age 27 or so. Russell Barkley has that number a little bit lower. I think he says between 12 and 30%. Right. But the majority of them will retain some form of executive function issues throughout their adulthood.
And what we're finding is increasingly...
Right. I was going to mention there are other neurological aspects to ADHD besides developmental delay. So there's certain areas of the brain that are smaller. There's certain types of electrical activity in the brain that's different. So although I presented those 2 aspects of neurology of ADHD today, there are other aspects that also interfere with their function that continue.
Right. Okay. Interesting question here from Laura, and this is still dealing with this issue of positive reinforcements versus consequences, which I think is so challenging for everyone. She says, I'm 100% for positive reinforcements, but as a parent, I struggle with how to handle certain behaviors that are not okay in any situation. For example, my son punched a kid at camp because he thought he was being teased, which he wasn't. As a parent, what do I do when he gets home? And we've all been there. So, yeah.
Right. I'm curious about what happened at camp itself.
What the consequences there?
What the consequences were there, because I think as a parent you want to be sure that something was done at the point of performance, like right then and there, where and when it happened, and conflict resolution is a good way to handle that issue. At home, I think it's important for you to rehearse with your son and practice what they could have done instead of lashing out. Also, reinforce problem-solving strategies. So reinforce stopping, taking a few deep breaths before they act. So just maybe then perhaps working with the camp in creating some sort of a visual reminder for your child to remember to stop, pause, take a few deep breaths before they lash out. Because that's typically, your child probably wasn't intending to hurt the other child, but just has a problem with impulse control, although I don't know your child's situation. But many kids with ADHD, it's not like they have a mean streak in their body. They just impulsively lash out. So dealing with that impulsivity. Yeah.
Right. Questions about ODD from a teacher. How do you deal with children who are oppositional in the classroom? And also from a parent. Are there different strategies for school with children with ODD? Are they the same as for ADHD?
Well, oppositional defiant disorder is not a neurological condition. It's an acquired condition. Russell Barkley likes to say that all kids with ADHD have latent oppositional defiant disorder, and given the environmental circumstances, they will become oppositional defiant. So regarding your question about strategies, I think with kids that are oppositional defiant, you want to be extra sure that you don't confront them and get into a power struggle. So providing them with choices is really important, and structuring those choices so that they don't have unlimited opportunities to exploit and manipulate the situation is also important.
Right.
So just giving them simple choices, helping them to understand the consequences of their actions is also important as well.
Okay. Just a note here from a parent who says, in terms of consequences, we often go the route of writing an apology to the other child or doing something nice for the other child as a teachable way to steer away from negative behavior with the consequence. That's interesting. Okay, Shari, I think we're out of time. Everyone, thank you so much for attending today. And Shari, thank you so much for all these practical tips. And here's to
thank you for having me.
For all of our children. And we hope you'll come
thank
back
you for your
year.
Great questions.
Thank you for being so willing to tackle all these tough topics and doing as much as you do for our kids in the classroom. Thanks, everybody. See you next week. Bye.